Yeah.
Hello. I would love to ask you to introduce yourself, starting with the pronunciation of your name, which I do not want to get wrong. Is it Algeo?
Algeo, yeah.
Algeo, okay.
The first syllable there.
Algeo, excellent.
Yeah, Matthew Algeo. I'm an author and journalist. I'm the host of Morning Edition on Kansas Public Radio right now.
I know it.
New York Secret Subway is my 8th book, and I first heard about the book, about the story about 5 years ago. And I found a blog rock band called Klaatu online. During the pandemic, I was listening to a lot of different they made a song called Sub Rosa Subway, which was the story of Alfred Beach and the destruction of underground pneumatic subway in 1870, which is not typical material for 70s prog rock bands, but it really got me interested in the story. I went down the proverbial rabbit hole, and here I am 5 years later having written a book about it. It's just such an interesting story with such interesting characters in an interesting time and place, and it just kept getting better and better the more I researched it. So here we are.
I wholeheartedly agree about the idea of how interesting this book is. When I first picked it up, I read the first 2 chapters, and I was thinking to myself, how is this guy going to get an entire book out of this one small project underneath Broadway in the mid 19th century? And as I kept reading, I realized it was less about the project itself and more about the cast of characters and the political climate and the context about which this is telling a story about New York. Not to overhype it, but it was giving very Caro in terms of the approach that you and the reverence and the attention to detail you gave to your cast of characters. Can you talk a little bit about your process, about how you decided to, from this one idea, how did it expand out, and then how did you kind of put the edge where it was the right frame for the story?
Yeah, you definitely, when you begin researching it, you're never quite sure if there's enough there. I have written books before about, I would call them small stories, but that talk about bigger themes, I guess. I mean, I tried to make the book about life in New York in 1870, which is a period that I think kind of gets overlooked in U.S. history, that period between the Civil War and World War I. And it's such a phenomenal period in the history of the country and in the history of New York City. So much is going on that this story, I think, gets lost in the shuffle. In the grand scheme of things in the history of New York City, Albert Beach's pneumatic subway in and of itself isn't exactly a huge story, but all the characters that are involved in this, all the thieves that are involved in this, mass transit, political corruption, invention and innovation in mid-19th century America. It really is one of those stories that has so many layers, so many tentacles going out into so many different subjects that it's the kind of story I really like to tell. I did a book about pedestrianism, which was competitive walking craze in the 1870s and 1880s, which largely took place in New York too. And it was kind of the same, it was kind of constructed the same way. You're really using this small story to tell a much bigger story about America and about New York at the time. And to be mentioned literally in the same breath as Caro is something that's clearly I'm not worthy of, but I love the Power Broker. I love the LBJ books, and I love the way he is able to weave things in, and I do try to do that in my own little way.
I absolutely felt that Boss Tweed is one of those characters that is sort of immortalized in this, like you said, sort of unfinished history of the U.S. between Reconstruction and World War I in a lot of ways. But he was maybe not even the prototype, because I'm sure before Boss Tweed, there was somebody else who was very interested in corruption before that, somebody before him. And this happened to be the iteration. So I'm curious, if you see what your thoughts are on the parallels between Boss Tweed and a guy like Robert. Do you think that he was sort of like proto Moses? Or I guess in your mind, now having done so much work on Boss Tweed here, what are some of the similarities between these two characters? If you can answer.
Yeah. You're right. Boss Tweed didn't appear out of nowhere. I mean, he was building on a long tradition of political corruption and graft that, in fact, goes back to the founding of Tammany Hall itself in the late 1700s and early 1800s. I mean, I think what Tweed saw himself doing was perfectly normal. He just happened to do it on a scale that it had never been attempted before. He, in a way, if you think of America industrializing in the period after the Civil War, mass production becoming possible, I think Tweed just saw himself as a kind of entrepreneur on the scale of, Harvard and Vanderbilt, right? I mean, his business runs political record. So to him, it wasn't as big a deal, I think, as other people obviously apprehended it. I think there are parallels between and Robert Moses to some extent. I think better parallels perhaps with Tweed and some contemporary politicians, and I don't want to get too into the weeds with this comparison with President Trump, and I'm not at all suggesting he's as corrupt as Tweed was. Maybe that remains to be seen. But Tweed and Trump both engendered a loyalty among their working class followers that is just hard to comprehend. Remember, Tweed himself is not Irish. He was of Scottish descent. He wasn't Catholic, yet he was beloved by the Irish Catholic immigrants who came to the U.S. and especially in New York by the tens of thousands in the 1860s. And so I see really striking similarities between Trump and Tweed in that respect, and also in the respect that Tweed wanted as well. He wanted to be perceived as wealthy. He had a huge mansion on Fifth Avenue. I mean, the guy was a state senator. His annual salary was, I think, $5,000 a year. So it was hard to explain how he had this tremendous wealth, but he didn't mind at all. He had tremendous loyalty. He knew how to get out the vote. He knew how to manipulate votes as well. He knew how to manipulate elections. And so I see a lot of parallels, not just with President Trump, but with a lot of modern politicians. I mean, in a way, Tweed really set the mold for the modern power-hungry politician. And maybe politicians learn something from him and are more careful about it now.
I think one of the other things that I loved about this book, I think, and I haven't read any of your other books yet, and I'm excited to now. Really love the way you take a very fiction-esque approach to the way you weave your stories, and so a lot of your narratives weave the way in and out of different chapters, which I found particularly compelling. You'll start a story in one chapter, introduce several more characters in the next chapter, and then bring it back around by adding such rich color of the environment and people and some of the names that are very familiar to New Yorkers today, the J.J. Astors and the Pierponts and the Habermeyers, all these characters. So it gives people who live in New York, it's definitely focused toward it, but people who don't live in New York, I assume will be a lot of the readers of your book, a sort of peek under the hood of how New York City politics worked in the late 19th century. I'm curious if you have any tips or tricks for aspiring writers that way of how to tell a story of maybe a kernel of truth and then sort of expand your thought process. Now having written 7 other books besides this one.
Wow. Let me think about that for a second. I guess the key is really finding a story that attracts those characters, right? You can't contrive ways to introduce those characters. Those characters have to appear naturally in the course of the story. Going back to Caro, the power broker, in a way, Moses is he's the main character, but he's just kind of the excuse for Caro to write about all these other amazing characters in the story. And so I think if you find a story that has those characters, that you don't have to contrive those characters. Look, as soon as I knew that Beach and Tweed had a connection, right there now you connected yourself to basically New York City municipal government in 1869 and 1870. Then Tweed gets elected to the state legislature, and now you get to talk about state politics, which was also very involved in this whole. So right there, you've got a whole stadium full of interesting characters that are going to help you write the story. But I do appreciate the things you said. You're very kind, and I try to spread it out a little bit. Bring characters in, then let them rest for a little bit, and then bring them back in again. And also in a way to try to give readers a break from Beach. It's always Beach, 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 right? I think you want to give your readers a little time away from the main characters sometimes. And even the main story, I'm going to these sidetracks about the history of pneumatics and George Medhurst with pyramids. I don't know if it's any interesting to anybody. I thought it was, but it's also kind of a type I'm doing that it gives people a little relief from their own story. It's a very heavy sort of political process story. So it's also hopefully that the characters and the stories to make them read a little easier.
The story is also a history of the media in the 19th century, which I found fascinating as well, which I think is a great lesson for folks looking to read or write about the history of city building and urbanism and science as well, is that there's always a commentary on what's happening in the built environment, and that planners in particular would be good to learn about how what they say actually interacts with the people that are going to be commenting on them. And I think a lot of planners think that we exist, and that's my training, my background as a planner, that we exist outside of this in a lot of ways. And I'm rambling, but I'm getting to my point here about some of the history on media and the fact that that Beach was one of the founders of Scientific American, which is a magazine that's now almost 200 years old and still has a mainstay in our leadership. As an aside, was the cartoonist Nast, was him or his family, is that a Condé Nast connection there? I made that connection in my brain, but I don't know if that's actually true.
I have no idea. I'm ashamed to say that you just put that in my head for the first time. I had always assumed it was not, just because it is so remote from today, but it's quite possible that is a continuation of his empire. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I learned about sort of how to read media in the 19th century is that it's sort of all connected in a lot of ways. The names that we learn about the 17th century come back in the 19th century. I loved your aside. I learned so much about I didn't know about the 12th of July protests at all. That was a great learning for me. I didn't realize, and I assume that it still exists in New York in some way or another, but it's hopefully not as violent as it was back in the 1800s as well. So I love this idea of understanding the reaction and the approach toward goings on in the political and land and the city building sphere have a very strong parallel and are very shaped by and for our media landscapes. How else is anybody supposed to know about these things going on, right?
I really think Beach was savvy. Beach came from a media background, as you mentioned. His father was New York Center reporter. His brother, Moses, was a state lawmaker. So Beach was no baby in the woods when it came to media and politics. And so as a kind of planner, a city planner, an urban planner, as an architect in a way, and as an advocate for great public works projects. He did not live in a bubble, right? He knew he had a good idea, but he also knew he had to sell the idea, he had to convince people it was a good idea. And I think a lot of times architects, I don't know much about the history of architecture. I'm a little outside of life. I think sometimes that they become so convinced that their ideas are so good that there is no compromise, right? There is no acceptable criticism. There's no plain media, right? I mean, Beach was brilliant. He invited the reporters down to the grand opening. I mean, those were the first people he thought of to invite. He would invite the New York Times, you had the New York Sun, the New York Post,
Right.
and they have a good place laid out. So you're absolutely right that he was thinking about how this project would be written about, how it would be commented on. And we also realized that that was, the interface between this project and the public, with these people. So these people needed to be, wooed.
I love the idea of, again, thinking about his role in the patent procedure. You colored this man as not just a advocate for trains and rail. This is one of his many ideas, and I don't think this was the comparison that we're going for, and I don't think there is a one-to-one, because there's a big difference in, I think, intent in a lot of ways. But does the pneumatic tube not have this at least a slight comparison with Musk and Hyperloop a little bit, trying to fight for an idea that like no one believes in and thinks technology is right? Did that come up in your thinking and as we're learning about
it did. I mean,
it
has to, I mean, it's just the comparison is so obvious. I will say that Beach had one advantage in that the technology he was working with had been proven to be pretty successful. The Hyperloop using magnetic propulsion, obviously we have maglev trains, but he hasn't really been demonstrated that it's feasible. And Beach also started very small, right? Let's build 300 feet of this thing and show it can work. I don't know that there's been a successful working model of the Hyperloop built. There's been some progress made toward that. But Beach just took it upon himself to build this little stretch. And as I said, building upon a technology that already existed and had been proven fairly successful. I think the idea that Beach had for an underground railroad, a subway, obviously, good idea. That the problem was propulsion, right? This is always the problem. The steam locomotives in a tunnel, obviously, you got smoke and cinders. Horses pulling streetcars and stagecoaches. Obviously, you have a lot of effluents, a lot of horse poop and pee. That was the beauty of Beach's idea, is that it was so much cleaner than the alternatives at the time. It was so much more comfortable, and it was so much more efficient that it was obvious from anyone who walked down the tunnel, and even just rode that 300 feet, that this was superior to what they already have. And we're yet to get that there with the Hyperloop. I mean, maybe someday we will get in a tube and be able to just even go from Santa Monica to down. I don't know. But in Beach's case, people were able to do it, and people were, could see obviously this was a superior method.
An obvious difference, we're now 150 years of putting stuff in the ground way. And so managing this, there's very little trench and public building done anymore. I mean, even tunnel boring machines have their serious issues. The birth of fiasco. Seattle, where I'm based for the time being, is a whole thing that got the commissioner fired, and so it's navigating a different set of political realities, I think, and I'm not quite sure with this polymath brain or his intent. It's hard to measure what Elon's intent is here with the Hyperloop. If it's for selling Teslas, I understand that, but it's just it doesn't like buses. That's a very different, I think, mentality. What Beach and his ilk were thinking about, because the idea was mass transit here. I mean, Elon's idea everyone keeps coming up against him, being like, "Well, you just inventing bus with less capacity and more expensive." And so I think there's probably something there. I've seen videos in Switzerland where cars get on sort of this auto train and they sort of push them through to maintain just easy speed and traffic in tunnels. And I see a lot of parables in the book, in your book, about sort of the competing technologies. Is electric, is it steam, it's going to be air, and this idea of like now go back around the bend of electric or gas propulsion here. I'm not sure steam is going to come back into play, but they talk about hydrogen, they talk about other types of fuel sources, and it feels like we're on this sort of repeat pattern here, and it's hard to say without the benefit of hindsight which technology is going to win, plus the 150 years of spewing particulate matter and other exhausts through the air has changed the dynamic as well. But I just wanted to have just a quick conversation, because I did notice that there's this polymath type behavior, sensational need to invent and create, or at least bring people around that event to create. I guess if we can turn the conversation back to the boss tweet, because it's an area of New York history that I'm particularly fond of in terms of it's like the laughable corruption that we look at now. Either Tweed or some other part of the setting time of this book. What was something that surprised you? What was something that you learned that you go, I never in a million years thought that was the way this played out? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think the thing that surprised me most about Tweed and the corruption was simply how transparent it was, that he didn't feel it necessary to hide it very much. Everybody seemed to know what was going on. Again, he lives in a mansion on Fifth Avenue when he is the city streets commissioner, not even that, assistant streets commissioner, right? So everybody knew something was going on. And the fact that Tweed actually kept ledgers detailing all the payments that he was making, the kickbacks he was getting, I mean, that was his downfall. Eventually, he had promised the New York County sheriff that he would pay him $30,000 for some expenses the sheriff had, and then apparently reneged on that, and that's what got the sheriff angry, and he got his hand on the ledgers. I guess it, along with that, is people's, and maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but people's acceptance of Tweed's corruption. I mean, even when it was obvious, people just seemed to accept it, that was the cost of doing business in New York. That was just part of the cost of living. And if you could get a piece of the pie, more power to you. Tweed's constituents admired him for the way he was so brash about accumulating wealth. Again, in some ways similar to the supporters of President Trump. And as I say it now, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but it did surprise me how brazen the corruption was and how lackadaisical the public seemed to be about it.
It's one of the parables that I like from this book, I think, that also compares to the current political climate with MAGA and President Trump, is that Boss Tweed undoing came from such a tiny kernel of happenstance in a lot of ways. When this guy O'Rourke became bookkeeper and all of a sudden was sort of like, uh-oh, what's this? I mean, it was the same thing that we saw in the 1975 fiscal crisis in New York, when it was just one bookkeeper at Chase Bank was finally like, wait a second, there's no assets here. And
Right.
No, I think the takeaway that I have that gives me some hope from this book, which is a really cool thing that I think other readers will have, is that downfall is coming, because it always has and it always will. And there's no way to predict where it's coming from. And there's no way to predict who it's going to be. And the combination, I'm reminded of this book that I read in graduate school called Normal Accidents, about the history of 3 Mile Island. And the fact that happened with 18, it wasn't one big problem. It wasn't, like the switch doesn't work. It was 18 things happening at once. And this guy felt sick. And this one switch had worked a million times before, stuck today. And the guy was in the bathroom or something along these lines. And that's where this is going to come from. And there's no way to predict it. And I think what we have to do is just sort of take care of each other a little bit here. I digress a little bit, but I think
I do want to say, I think your point, I hadn't really thought about New York and the 75 fiscal crisis. It made me think of Bernie Madoff. And who was the guy who was was it in Boston or something? There was one guy where they said, try to replicate this. And he came back in 10 minutes later and said, it's a pyramid scheme. And he tried to convince the SEC for years to look into it. So it struck me as similar like that too. Like, yeah, eventually somebody will find out. And then eventually people who need to know will find out. Hopefully.
You know, the people in charge now, I use that word very loosely, the people who are feigning leadership at the top right now, they're gonna annoy the wrong people at some point. You know, the people that are actually the people behind the people. There's going to be something, and we don't know what the combination of this is going to be. Bernie Madoff's a great example. I think Elizabeth Holmes is another example. Like, there's examples throughout history of these hucksters, and it happens. And this is different because it's scale, I think, right?
Right. But and the other thing along those lines, and this is getting totally off topic, but things can change fast. Like, history can change quicker than you think, right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, January of 1989, nobody thought the Berlin Wall was going anywhere, right? Nobody thought the Soviet Union was going anywhere. Things can change, and they can change fast. And,
yeah. I mean, back to the book. I think I can bring this back to the book.
All right, do it.
Is about, one decision, one veto, one boss tweet wasn't able to convince one alderman or one senator or assemblyman that his plan was better than another plan, and maybe we get the Broadway pneumatic tube underneath, and like that's the dominant technology instead of electric or steam, or maybe the L's don't come into play. It's one small, and we don't know how quickly it can change. I mean, there's very little happening in New York, that level of veracity at this point, I think. But again, we don't know, right? Like, congestion could implode tomorrow. We have no idea. Or, we could strike something underground along Second Avenue subway doesn't finish. Or positively, there's a way somebody introduces a bill in the legislature to either remove or cap the BQE or something along these lines, and these things change instantaneously, or maybe there's so many things you don't know. And I think that's what I want by modern leaders and thinkers, is the ability to be prepared by being prolific in their interests, a mind work. Why I think Pete's such an interesting character to writers, because if not the subway, he would have found something else to invent or something. This just happened to be
right.
It collided with all these things happening at once, which is a very interesting story. That's why I really
thank you. It was such a cool era, because it was one of these times where there was a weird kind of optimism that any problem could be fixed with an invention. I think there's a lot of parallels with today, that any problem can be fixed with an app or artificial intelligence, that any problem can eventually be fixed by technology. Back then, though, the problems were more prosaic, right? How do we sew a dress without having to labor over it for 20 hours? How do we move large, heavy freight over long distances efficiently? It was a really innovative time in history. And I think it was also a time that it freaked people out, the changes that were occurring, especially after the Civil War. The number of patents doubles in basically 2 years. Suddenly it seems there are new inventions everywhere. And I think there's a lot of fear that people have now about technology taking over our lives that people had 150 years ago. I mean, just as an aside in there, I talk about the invention, Edison invents the phonograph and he takes it to Alfred Beach to demonstrate it. But just the concept that your voice would survive after you died totally freaked people out, right? I mean, I could hear my mother's voice 15 years after she's dead. That was just astounding to people, and you can understand the trepidation people had.
So I guess the question I had about, what our current leaders can learn from this. I mean, I guess what does it take away for our current MTA from any of the learning stuff built in that sort of subway wars between 1816 and 1916? Well, do you have any thoughts here? This is totally speculative, of course.
Yeah.
From doing your research here, I don't want to put you on the spot, so you can say, I don't want to guess. But if you have any thoughts about how to
I guess
yeah,
I don't know if you know what's going on in Philadelphia with SEPTA, the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, constantly going to the legislature, trying to get funding. And I see exactly what was happening in 1868, 69, 70, New York State and New York City. That's happening in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia right now. One of the problems that anyone who proposed a mass transit plan for New York City had to overcome was the fact you had to get a charter from the state legislature, right? You had to get a charter from Albany. And there were the upstate, or the country lawmakers, they called them, the country lawmakers, upstate New York lawmakers. You had to convince them that this was a project worth their support. And I think in Beach's case, he wasn't able to overcome that obstacle completely. He did win two charters, but not by margins sufficient to overcome the veto. And so I think the idea that sometimes we have to act in the best interests of regions and groups outside our core constituency is something that needs to be reinforced, right? I mean, eventually it came around, and American cities for a time had the most incredible rapid transit, urban mass transit systems in the world. And if you see how mass transit systems are funded in other countries, you'll see that the cost is spread much more widely than it is in the US. So that's what I think. I guess, if Beach had succeeded, would New York City have this amazing system of pneumatic tube subways? To be honest, I think electricity probably would have proven to be superior as a means of moving people. Building these fans every station, blowing down, sucking down. I mean, Siemens was a genius. He figured out, let's just run the current through a rail. I mean, talk about whoa, that's crazy, man. How could we get the electricity to the motor? And I think that would have happened. But exactly. And I think Beach had a role in that, right? I mean, Beach was part of that chain of events that leads us to where we are in a lot of our modern. And you got to give Beach credit for this. He proved you could build a tunnel under Broadway, and it wouldn't sink. The buildings wouldn't collapse. A.T. Stewart's dear Marble Palace wouldn't fall into the gutter. He proved it was feasible. He proved it was doable.
Yeah, I mean, very, very unlikely that any modern beach be able to do any of this in private and secret, especially for surveillance state. But again, the technology is of the time and of the place. We have a different type of, it's more digital infrastructure that's happening, right, in private and in secret now, visible, which makes it a lot harder to see. But again, it's the true information highway. I guess any last thoughts here? I don't want to belabor this point. I think we've got a really great conversation. I've got a lot of great material.
Yeah, I just think that Beach really deserves to be remembered, not even so much for the tunnel as for his contributions to American inventors really for the 50 years that he was editor of Scientific American and the support he gave inventors, large and small. He's best known for the work he did, of course, with Edison and Morse and Bell and all these guys, but pretty much anybody who walked into his office wanted advice. And I think the most amazing statistic of all is that of all the millions of patents that have been granted in the US, the Beach firm, which went out of business in 1948, still accounts for 1.6%. I mean, these guys,
That's
it basically
crazy.
a third of all patents in the second half of the 19th century went through Alfred Beach's patent agency. So he's not in the Inventors Hall of Fame. So that's my campaign, is to get him into the Inventors Hall of Fame. Yeah.
And that's a good campaign. I think your book makes the good case to do it. And, the last page of your book talks about how he's nominally remembered now, his contributions to education and for educating freed slaves, remnants for war. So really, it's just fascinating that I wish, and I'll end on this, I wish Elon would think something.
Yeah, it's one of the differences, I think, between like the great industrialists and the robber barons of the 19th century. I think a lot of them, whether they felt compelled or coerced, did give a lot of their money away. And I think it would be nice to see a little bit more charitable giving from some of the multi-billionaires.
I think that it was certainly cultural, which is the idea of shame felt back in the day. And while they may have not felt it in business, they felt that it was very duty-driven society as well. They wanted to look like society, lest they be sort of like nominally excluded from it. And I think it'd be great to have these folks give back. It's amazing to me that the Met in New York is ever scrounging for money ever for any of our museums. It's very confusing to me that we live in a city of billionaires and almost trillionaires, and they're still begging for money and making this not a real public center is where it's the word.
So Carnegie, Carnegie, he shot all the strikers, but he did give us a lot of good libraries, right?
I guess hold your nose up for the best, right?
Yeah, there you go. No, that should be our new national motto.
Okay, I'm gonna